letting you peek inside the source code of the global control matrix. This is the Daniel Natal Show. Letting you take a peek inside the source code of the global control matrix. Peeling back the front and letting you take a peek inside the global control matrix. This is the Daniel Natal Show. I was reading a classic of 19th century Western literature with my son, Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground. I hadn't read it since I was his age, so basically I only remembered it in dim outline. Rereading it, however, I was struck by many things that happened back in 1864 in Russia. They parallel things happening now in many ways. They parallel things happening now in many ways. Anyway, as I was saying, Russia had one foot in the old agrarian period and one foot in the coming industrial age. Dostoevsky is famous in part because of his creation of what is now known in literature as the superfluous man. This was the individual who felt like his life didn't matter, like he was a cog in a giant bureaucratic machine that crushed out his spirit. At this particular time period, the Industrial Revolution was upending society in many ways. Young men were leaving family farms and moving to the cities to find jobs in factories or government civil service. This eroded the family structure that had been in sway for millennia, creating vast new swaths of unmoored, lonely people, cut off from meaningful communication and relationships, spiritually withering inside. When Notes from the Underground begins, we see the angry, embittered narrator expressing his contempt for the world. He starts by saying that he is alcoholic, and though his liver requires medical attention, he is still not going to see a doctor, out of spite, even though he knows that he's only hurting himself. Dostoevsky has this great run about how the people creating this new science-based bureaucratic society have made a mistake in thinking that people only need material things. He says that society can't be run according to actuarial tables and mathematics, and concentrating more on GDP than on people. Their civilization was becoming inhuman. It required people to be robots, cogs in a vast machine that crushed out the miracle of human personality. Dostoevsky piqued my interest by saying that this strident materialism led to an adverse reaction in a particular subset of society, and it reminded me of the modern social justice warrior. We think of these pink-haired, tattooed, metal-pierced individuals as frivolous curiosities, people going through a stage perhaps, but really, they're an artifact of a machine age, an anti-human system where everything is regimented and all time apportioned out for particular activities. These are the kids who had helicopter parents and who didn't have a moment of peace to themselves to sort their thoughts out. So like Dostoevsky's underground man, they rebel from science, logic, and reason by retreating into irrationality. We read, "We sometimes choose absolute nonsense because in our foolishness we see in that nonsense the easiest means for attaining a supposed advantage. But when all that is explained and worked out on paper, which is perfectly possible for it is contemptible and senseless to suppose that some laws of nature man will never understand, then certainly so-called desires will no longer exist. For if a desire should come into conflict with reason, we shall then reason and not desire, because it will be impossible retaining our reason to be senseless in our desires, and in that way knowingly act against reason and desire to injure ourselves." In Dostoevsky's psychological profile of these people, we see why some of them engage in the self-harm that they do. Conservatives make a huge mistake when they try to debate such people, because they fundamentally don't understand this retreat into the irrational. Why, for instance, social justice warriors reject the two sexes of forensic science and insist on an additional 57 genders, or why they engage in the patently contradictory positions of saying that races don't exist, but that white people are evil, or that men can't have an opinion on abortion because men can't understand what it's like to be a woman, while on the other hand saying that men can be women. Conservatives see the whole raft of contradictory policy positions of the left, and they think they have an aha moment in being able to debunk their social justice warrior opponent, not understanding that these people are by design committed to the irrational. Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter described them as far back as the 1930s, saying that such people incline toward magical thinking, and he characterizes them by saying that they have the disregard of what we call logic, and in particular, the rule that excludes contradiction. He adds, "The similarity of this type of mental process with the mental processes of neurotics has been pointed out by G. Dramard, 1911, and S. Freud, Totem and Taboo, 1913. The conservative thinks that by appealing to facts, logic, and evidence, that he will win over these people. In doing so, he fundamentally misunderstands their illness. Their disease is a disease of modernity, of materialism. The people who care more about GDP than about people created this efficient society, but forgot that man does not live by GDP alone. He requires community, faith, spirituality. Aristotle in Politics said that the four basic things that a state does is creating infrastructure, establishing a judiciary, assembling a military, and taking care of the temple. In America, we did the first three and forgot about the fourth. Granted, when America was founded, we were building on colonies started by Puritans, Quakers, and other religious sects. Our churches and faith-based communities enjoyed a central position in our society, so when the Founding Fathers built a government, they didn't think that they had to address this component. They could afford to create a more skeletal government structure. What was that John Adams quote? "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." But what happens when secularism gains an ascendancy and the church starts to erode? There's now a hole at the center of the society that can't be filled with the money motive. Capitalism is not a substitute for community, as some in conservative Inc. keep promoting. Even as recently as our fight with the Soviet Union, we as a society differentiated ourselves by saying that unlike them, we weren't godless atheists. We put in God we trust on our money, or one nation under God in our Pledge of Allegiance during this time period. So even in the 1950s and 60s, we knew that rapacious capitalism had to be counterbalanced by Christian mercy and compassion. Take away Christian mercy and compassion, and we have what we have now. A soul-crushing machine that many kids are terrified of being swallowed up by. Devoid of any depth or meaning, other than being told to be a good consumer, they manifest a twisted, perverted form of a spiritual impulse. Like global warming girls who act like secular nuns and commit to celibacy in the name of restraining their carbon footprint.
We feel too afraid to have kids because we feel that we're heading towards civilization breakdown as a result of the environmental crisis and the sort of mismanagement or political inertia over dealing with it.
Instead of Armageddon coming because of man's sins, the narrative has changed to a climate emergency which will kill us due to our sinful consumption. Instead of the Catholic Church, Catholic meaning universal, these young people yearn for a universal government which will expiate their sins. These young people are fanatics in the medieval sense of the mystics who would whip themselves in the mortifications of the flesh. They are what Nietzsche calls the haters of life, who dedicate themselves to a denunciation of the world and a commitment to its destruction. Conservatives, be wary of appeals to logic when talking to them. They hate logic. It's what they're rebelling against. What they're suffering from is deeper than mental illness. It's spiritual illness. Conservatives, in dealing with them, prepare yourself accordingly. P.S. Anyone want to buy a toupee? Retail $8. Before you is a moral puzzle. If you push this button, something advantageous will happen for you. But be warned, if you do, a pompous elitist who you do not know and who you will never meet will be heckled mercilessly. The choice is yours. Choose wisely.